Okay, so we are pleased to welcome Anthony Meacock. Hello.
Hey.
He studied architecture in England and finished his master in 2013. He has taken an active role in education as a tutor at the University of Westminster and currently at the AA. Also, he's familiar with Basel. He worked there at Christian Gappenbein's office for 8 months. He was one of the founding members of the Assemble Collective, which was founded in 2010. We asked him what his favorite material is, but he doesn't have a favorite material. He used to be a carpenter before, so he's very comfortable with timber though. About Assemble. So Assemble was founded in 2010, and it's a multidisciplinary collective of about 16 to 20 people working on architecture, design, and art. The practice works collaboratively with the local communities and craftsmen. The collective's cooperative working method leads to built social and research-based work of various scales. In 2015, they won the Turner Prize, a prestigious art prize for British artists, for the Granby Four Streets project. And we are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Yeah, nice to be here. I'm going to try and cover everything in about 40 minutes to give some time for questions. And then I've got a bunch of other stuff, so if anything comes up, maybe I can pull it up. But yeah, as I said, I'm part of Assemble. We started loosely in 2010 with our first project, the Cineroleum. We were something called a community interest company, so essentially a charity for a few years during our first couple of projects. More recently, we're now structured as a partnership, so a limited liability partnership, where the original kind of founders are partners, but that all employees, after 2 years of work, are invited to join the partnership. So that's, I guess we're not technically a collective in terms of structure, but that's how we enable kind of everyone who's worked with us to take part. And now we have three separate subsidiary companies: Assemble Design, which designs buildings, exhibitions, art, organizations, furniture; Sugar House Studios, which manages a network of currently 3 affordable workspaces in London and is currently in conversations for 3 or 4 more. And then under that, a smaller construction company called Standard & General, which mainly works on our own projects, but has done some small kind of other construction projects on the side. So that's extremely brief summary of what kind of Assemble currently is. It's worth saying it's kind of always evolved. And so in 5 years' time, it'll probably be quite a different organization yet again. Given where you are in the year and what kind of I understand about the brief, the thing I'd like to frame the projects around is this idea about how we learn through the work we do, and how a kind of hands-on understanding enables us to kind of learn through the work we do. We're particularly interested in the way that you learn through kind of manual labor, through manual work. This idea from Tim Ingold, who kind of wrote a PhD on making, that you generate knowledge through your field of practice. And that's a very different knowledge, the type of knowledge you get from like reading, and is a much more kind of a deep knowledge when it comes to practical considerations. It's an idea that's quite old. So Ruskin, when he was teaching at Oxford, famously got his students to build a road, a kind of road to nowhere, that included kind of students like Oscar Wilde and Arnold Toynbee. The kind of East London Guild of Handicraft was a similar kind of collaborative created by Ashby, so one of the proponents of the arts and craft movement. Dartington Hall School, which grew into Schumacher College, and kind of the work that Schumacher started in the 1920s, which is really the idea of learning through artworks. In Russia, you had the technical schools in Moscow. In America, you had Black Mountain College. So the idea of these kind of institutions that enable like learning through making as a kind of alternative pedagogical model have quite a long history, and we're aware that we're kind of borrowing on these kind of movements and these ideas. And I guess our work in both the projects we've done and the way we work are kind of deeply invested in this way of working. Viewing each project as an opportunity to develop skills through practice, through learning, and in doing so share that skills with others, both the people we work with, but also in terms of fostering a kind of collective culture. I guess this type of thing. So I'm going to start with the first project, which is kind of our creation myth. It's how we started. It's a little bit kind of fuzzy depending who you talk to. Remember it slightly differently. The Cineralium was a petrol station that we turned temporarily over the course of summer into a cinema. At the time, we weren't called Assemble. We didn't really have an agenda. We'd just come out of university into the recession caused by the 2008 financial crisis, and basically were frustrated with the type of work we were being asked to do as architects, not architects, as kind of architectural assistants in the world, and just desired to do something. And as a group of friends, we gathered gathered around the idea of making something together, and through that becoming the expression of the work. We would design it, test it, kind of make it. So these are kind of the chairs that were kind of fabricated from scaffold boards, which have now become kind of the universal kind of language of the ad hoc, but at the time was kind of less so. Kind of the signage, the marquetry, and these kind of slightly terrifying vacuum-formed ceiling tiles. We'd program the screenings, so we'd organise all the showings. And once it's opened, we would be the usher, the popcorn seller, the technicians, each evening ending the film by 12 of us having to hoist the curtain as a kind of final theatrical act, thrusting the audience back into the street. The project is important because it established the method of collaborative working and collective practice, and that while we don't work in the same way in terms of its volunteer and without kind of with this sort of structure, the underpinning of working collectively through problems and through making is something we've really tried to hold on to. At the other end of our range of work is Goldsmith's Centre for Contemporary Art, and this is a kind of far more traditional architectural commission. It was our first permanent project, and it was won through open competition, which was a huge risk for the client, taking on a kind of totally untested company such as us. The site was the kind of old working end of a Victorian bathhouse that had been bought by Goldsmith College as part of the University of London, and had kind of undergone a series of fairly unsympathetic renovations. And kind of to maintain a hands-on way of working, we basically adopted a method of working through kind of large-scale models. And we find that large-scale models are a good way of enabling collaborative working. They don't require deep architectural knowledge. They don't require the ability to read plans. They're kind of very obvious. They're very manifest. And through large-scale models, you can bring a lot of people into the process that otherwise would be excluded from it, and create an interactive intervention that enables a kind of much more dynamic conversation. We develop design through large-scale models throughout. So this is a 1:20 of the entrance space. To test the articulation of individual elements, scale, colours, materials. And doing this allows us to get as close as possible to the feeling of the building without, building kind of full-scale mock-ups in a way that we don't think really happens with digital modelling. The digital modelling kind of lies in a way that actually physical model we feel doesn't. So this is the actual space. This is the model for the clerestory gallery and the actual space. Model of this kind of strange, raw tank space. So we kind of maintain the existing water tanks as this kind of very strange exhibition space that you kind of inside the tank. The kind of final version, this kind of lantern gallery, and the final version. And then in the core of this building, a kind of found space was this large-scale project space that the whole building kind of revolves around and is now kind of host to talks, workshops, but also kind of large-scale installations. And while we couldn't build the building ourselves, it was built by contractors, I think we tried to maintain a direct connection to the making of the building across the materials, across scales. So whether that's, this thing here is a stain we developed, well not developed, it's iron acetate, so you basically get iron wool and dissolve it in vinegar, and it creates this kind of quite beautiful grey colour. Tiles that were developed, they were developed in coordination with another project, and these are kind of cementitious tiles, so kind of a series of bespoke products. The last of which was the kind of facade, the decorative facade. And we really wanted to have an element that spoke to the architecture of the industrial tanks that was, but in a way that was much more affordable, much cheaper. And complete this one-to-one prototype that basically took standard agricultural fibre cement cladding like you'd see in a farm, but articulated it, stained it, and treated it in a way that became something different, that became something special. And then kind of produced this as a package in our studio. So we produced the whole set of cladding that was then installed by the main contractor on the finished building. So this is it, kind of complete. We lost the nice cornice detail for cost reasons, as so often happens. But I guess the feeling is that like it still gives a kind of hand-built, hand-stained, it's like a feeling of that it expresses the hand of the maker throughout the building, even a building that's built in a very kind of standard way. I'm aware that you're currently mainly dealing with materials, but for us sometimes the making of the organisation is as important as the physical infrastructure. So at the Adventure Street Playground in Glasgow, here the main intervention was the creation of a fence, and the creation of a fence that allowed children to play in a special way. It stemmed from the idea that, it stemmed from looking at an area. So Dalmarnock is one of the poorest areas in Glasgow, one of the poorest areas of the EU. 54% of children are below the poverty line. An area where kind of playgrounds look like this. And kind of bringing with that a kind of reading we were doing at the time onto the history of adventure playgrounds, which is kind of deeply embedded with the anarchist movement and the idea of kind of expression of agency within cities. Found this empty site that anecdotally had been a playground at some point, but had been barred out of use for many years. And in this project, as I said, the design work was really about enabling it to become a space of ownership for children. And the primary role really was to create a social and physical infrastructure that enabled that to happen. So the first step was just to open the site up. This is an infamous mud fight that happened on the first weekend. Was looking at barriers the children had to play. And so this is an area, like I said, it's very poor. Lots of children don't have proper outside clothing. And so something as simple as providing boots and jackets is transformative because it means they don't come home and get shouted at by their parents when they're muddy. And so actually like that's more critical than designing a kind of pretty thing. Providing food, this is an area of high malnutrition and poor food. And like I said, providing this state of exception that children could own and manipulate in a slightly chaotic way that doesn't necessarily speak to an adult appreciation of aesthetics or beauty, that take kind of materials as rubbish and transform them through invention, that fundamentally is a malleable landscape that is always changing, that the children always have a hand in changing, and the children always have an interest, always have an influence on. The playground celebrated its 5th birthday and is now working as an independent charity. This is a short video, I'll cut short because I don't have a huge amount of time, just of this was titled The Bridge of Death, and I guess it's a good indication of the type of play we mean. In that essentially the important things that the children are encouraged to self-organised. The play workers are there just to ensure that they are safe, a nurturing environment, but ultimately the space is the children's to control, and that's really kind of primary. I think this idea of how enabling play, enabling kind of ownership of the space around us is really critical for the way we practice, and it applies to kind of work for all ages. The next set of projects is a kind of slightly meatier collection of work, which is I guess the ongoing work we undertook in Granby 4 Streets in Liverpool. So if you don't know, Liverpool is a city in northern England. It formerly was an extremely wealthy port city. In the 1850s, it was kind of wealthier and more prosperous than London. And this wealth really created a huge boom from the 1850s onwards. The area we're in is just outside the centre, Granby. Historically, it was very prosperous. It was a kind of working class area that was dock workers mainly, but had a kind of real energy to it. However, in common with, I guess, a large quantity of industrial centres in the world, from the 1930s onwards, really, Liverpool suffered a kind of long-term decline of its industry that peaked in the 70s and 80s with, I guess, a combination of a very racist police force, fairly racist government policy, like kind of critical economic decline, high unemployment, that eventually led to this uprising against the police force that the Liverpool uprising in 1981. Government policy and the way they dealt with it was a policy called managed decline. And this was basically to allow the area to decay, to move people out of it, to demolish whole swathes of it. And the idea being that through the demolition and rebuilding at lower density, you kind of bring the value back up. So it's a kind of economic way of fixing a social crisis. So these two maps show the area in 1950. So Granby Street is this kind of main high street that runs north-south. And then the map on the right, which is, they're a bit washed out, but you kind of get the picture, is the same area in 2016. And you can see that this former high street has been cut off from the city at the top, so it no longer kind of runs all the way up. And of the original street grid, only 4 are left. And so the reason why it's called Granby 4 Streets is it's the 4 streets left of the original street pattern. The rest being kind of replaced with this kind of very uninspiring, like mid-noughties from the 80s onwards kind of suburban development. And in the area we're in, essentially there were a kind of group of residents who were stuck. They either couldn't sell their houses or didn't want to move out for various reasons. And in the context of the local government abandoning them, took on kind of ownership of the street for themselves. And through kind of small acts of, I guess, of maintenance and of care, sought to transform the kind of this dereliction into something that felt more like home. So they painted the streets, the kind of boarded up houses opposite them. They cleaned the area. This is a context. The streetlights weren't maintained. The bins weren't collected during this period. They started gardening the streets and create this. So using the void created essentially through kind of neglect, took on this freedom to establish a kind of real community in this area. In 2011, they formed a community land trust, which is that a structure that exists in Switzerland to the same extent? Probably not. So community land trust is, I think it actually started in the States, but the idea is it's a way of a group of people who are invested in a local area taking ownership of an asset. I think originally it was designed around things like shops or pubs or post offices, and the idea being like a village could own, rather than a commercial developer who couldn't make enough money off an asset, a village could own a pub and actually didn't have to make money because it was seen as an asset for the entire community. In the early 2000s, it kind of morphed into becoming more about housing and other provision. And I think there's now about 7,500 CLTs in the UK. And so they're kind of a growing movement of ownership that is democratic and collective. And the idea being that anyone who has an interest in the area, so that is either lives in the area, works in the area, shops in the area, is able to join the CLT as a member and vote on it. And so it's quite an interesting form of ownership, especially in somewhere like the UK where private ownership is so dominant, and the majority of state housing is over time being sold off from policies from the 80s. So anyway, they formed a CLT with the explicit aim of attempting to, I guess, gradually refurbish the streets around them and providing kind of long-term affordable housing that would remain permanently in community ownership. And I think critically, they wanted to challenge the idea that the only solution to areas of dereliction is a kind of tabula rasa, knock it down and start again, which, as you can see from the previous map, is the kind of predominant mode. It's like you clear it or you start again. So this is when we met them, just after they'd kind of formed the CLT, and essentially worked very closely with them and to create a sort of alternative master plan, a master plan that looked at starting with what was there and what was valuable and developing an incremental approach to change that created a network of projects that could be small scale, could be opportunistic, and could be overall ambitious, that over time built to a kind of a proposal for the whole area. The first work to start was taking on 10 empty houses on Ken Street. So that was one of the streets that runs runs opposite direction to Granby Street. And these were kind of houses that had been, again, empty for 20 years or so. A lot of them been subject to arson attack, water ingress. And so we adopted a kind of very, I guess, gentle approach that really responded to the conditions within each house and what opportunities there to create something that was slightly more special. So something like often looking at something like here, the pitch roof where the ceiling had collapsed, that offers the kind of possibility of making a vaulted roof. Looking at kind of careful selection of colours. Generally working with an extremely limited amount of funding. So we had about £50,000 per house to renovate. But through doing so, create something that felt like it was special, felt that it was cared for. So a lot of the details are kind of very stripped bare, stripped minimal, but that had an element of care. With all of this, we reserved 5% of the budget into what we kind of termed like enrichment. An idea, it kind of stemmed from this. So this is a sign that's on the door of kind of when they board up a house, which is the idea that all items of value have been removed from this house. And so the idea of what we were doing is we need to add value back into the houses. Everything's been taken away, we need to start bringing it back. Kind of a key moment of this was the fireplace. So we collected broken bricks, rubble, set up a small workshop in the back of one of the houses, and turned these into a new mantelpiece for each of the houses. So this is one that was made for one of the original residents, Eleanor. This is one in a house that is kind of complete but empty. This is one as they kind of start to be occupied and taken. But what we really like is this image, which is someone who's moved in, obviously doesn't like our aesthetic, but the fireplace still stays. And this idea that the house is changeable, is malleable, someone can live in it, inhabit it how they see fit, but that these elements are special, the kind of phoenix moment of the hearth of the home still kind of is kind of deeply present. And then from the start of the project, the idea that it was never supposed to be just about housing. The idea that to rebuild an area, for an area to be functional, it needs to be more than a dormitory. It needs economic activity, it needs commercial activity, it needs communal activity. And so Granby Workshop basically was born out of that intention to make a business that could occupy the high street in one of the empty shop corners, that could train and employ local people, building off the kind of investment and the momentum from renovating houses. It partly developed, or at least the opportunity to push it forward as an idea, came from the surprise of being nominated by the Turner Prize. And so this is a kind of basic diagram of the model, which are these products that were designed for the houses, set up a workshop to produce them locally. They're sold through the kind of the press coverage of the Turner Prize. We kind of peddle them everywhere, and that income then comes back. And the idea being that's 5% of the budget that we reserve isn't just being used to beautify the house, it's also being used to generate employment, to generate kind of multiplier effects, to keep that economic investment in the area we're in. And doing so, it kind of generates far more value than if, let's say, we bought tiles in from Italy. Not that they would be bad, but that money is then disappearing as fast as it's arriving. And through all these materials, the idea, is that not playing? Okay. The idea of generating a series of products and a series of items that, while were kind of mass-produced of sort, or like mass-producible, very much bore the fingerprint, bore the kind of mark of their maker, working across a kind of huge range of different materials. So from fabrics, ceramics. This video there is the smoke firing, the knobs, kind of marbled lampshade. I mean, to be honest, it was way too many things for any kind of one business to take on. This range of products was launched through the showroom at the Turner Prize exhibition. At the same time, we launched a website that allowed people to kind of buy the products. So this is kind of the initial range. And over time, the workshop has kind of adapted. I mean, I think we were probably fairly naive when we went to kind of create a business. The economic realities of actually making it viable are complex, but the workshop is now, as of last year, an independent organisation. It's an employee-owned CIC as well. Still located in Granby. Current employee is 8 people, but over time has morphed to focus explicitly on ceramics, really kind of focus on ceramics. Most recently, it's just launched what we, as far as we know, is the first collection of nearly 100% recycled ceramic ware. So the ceramic body is fully recycled from, it's basically a slip that would otherwise be dumped from commercial ceramic works. The glaze is almost entirely recycled. I think we worked out it's like 99.99% recycled from kind of waste. There's like 2 or 3 ingredients in the glaze that has to be virgin, otherwise the glaze just didn't work. And I guess there's an idea of how the kind of creation of an organisation is kind of, it feels kind of critical in our work, that actually sometimes the best thing to do is to kind of walk away from something and let it exist in its own terms. The final project in Liverpool I would like to talk through then is Granby Winter Garden. And so, I guess, like I said, it's kind of this approach about multiple uses in an area is really important. And so this was really about looking at how you can create a community centre, a centre for the community to gather that might be provided by a pub or something similar. It occupies 2 adjacent houses, and they were in particularly poor condition, and so in the first pass of housing were basically not affordable, be turned back into housing. So they're kind of left in this derelict state. And we had this ongoing idea about creating a kind of garden inside the derelict houses. In the context of Liverpool, where the weather is bad a lot of the time, I mean, as it is, and wet, the idea of a kind of indoor gathering space seemed really valuable, but also playing on the fact that one of the key way the residents had kind of challenged the dereliction and taken on ownership of the area was through gardening and through gardening the streets. Again, working through large models as a design and communication tool. So this is presenting it at the kind of monthly market that occurs on Granby Street as a way of building momentum and understanding and essentially, I guess, consultation with people. Working through material palette in a hands-on way. So these were samples for the kind of mortar and concrete finishes, so that would be like a new floor. But simultaneously also working through the economics and business plan. So to ensure that the project was viable. You don't have to look at the numbers, it's probably deeply uninteresting. But to ensure that the project was viable in the long term, that actually when this thing is finished, it can pay for its own existence. It doesn't have to close in a year because it doesn't have any funding. The garden launched in 2019. So this is a kind of picture from the launch. It's centered around the kind of full-scale tree in the heart of the garden. But it creates this kind of large open space that can host a huge variety of events. It's hosted birthdays, it's hosted concerts, it's hosted galleries, it's hosted workshops. It hosts meetings of the CLT, so where the board meet or where the wider CLT members meet. Kind of a couple more pictures. This is a photo of like I think it was a wreath making workshop they did before Christmas. Working closely with Granby Workshop to create a range of special moments. So this is the rainwater tank that's covered in caustic tiles that were developed for a project for the Venice Biennale actually a few years ago. Bespoke tiles in the bathrooms that were kind of double fired, so it kind of creates these strange gradients. And then on the first floor, the creation of a guest room that serves as a kind of collective guest room for the area, but also serves as like an Airbnb that generates income for the garden. So we're saying in the last couple of years that hasn't worked fantastically well because no one's been able to travel. But the garden is finally kind of reopening slowly again after it's been a bit of a difficult, it's been a difficult year for most people, so but they're not immune. But it is now kind of open to the public again and starting to get people staying into it. Cool. I've got to say this. And the kind of this aim of the project was that to show that even with a very tight budget, with a very restricted budget, you could still generate an extraordinary space. And so for a budget that was comparable to what is normally done with very boring, very kind of run-of-the-mill projects, you could still create something that was extraordinary. I thought I'd end this little section and then have some questions on a quote from John Dewey, who was a kind of educational philosopher in the late 19th, early 20th century, who was kind of behind a lot of this stuff, who was really one of the kind of birth fathers of kind of child-led learning, which is give the people something to do, not something to learn. The doing of itself is such a nature that demands thinking. Learning naturally results. And I think as a nice way of ending what I was sort of talking about, now it feels like that's a good a good kind of what's the word I want? A good thing to hold, that actually you learn through doing, and sometimes you only know what you've learned after you've done it and reflecting on it. I thought I'd pause there to see if there are any questions, and also to see if there's anything particular that anyone wants to hear about, because I've got a few other projects I can talk about. Or I can also talk about the way Assemble is structured. That often comes up. So I kind of thought I'd open it up to you guys and just to see what if there's anything in particular, or I can ramble on for a bit. But
any questions? Or time, everybody time?
Could you go maybe more into detail on how Assemble is organized?
yeah. Is that useful? I'm going to have to jump presentation quickly.
Maybe my question would link to that, because like by looking at these projects, I was wondering how was your financing of them? How did you finance yourselves? Because these were projects with very low budget. So how, like as you as architects,
So the answer to that is it depends on the project, really. So maybe just going through the project I've shown you, the Cineroleum was funded with a very small grant for £5,000 from a charity called Ideas Tap that doesn't exist anymore, but was set up to distribute arts funding to younger people. And then we all put in about £100 of our own money, and that kind of gave the float for that. Folly for a Flyover, the second project, was maybe I'll bring this up because I can go try and find images for some of them. Do I have any? Yeah, this is Folly for a Flyer. So that was our second project. That was a kind of larger grant for about £40,000 that was linked to the Olympic Games being in London. So before the Olympic Games, they had a program of these kind of £40,000 grants. Goldsmiths was a competition, so that had a traditional client. Bolton Street Adventure Playground was actually an arts prize. It was a commission that I think they were probably imagining like a sculpture somewhere. And we were partnered with this group called Create, who we've worked with quite a lot. They were actually helped secure the funding for this project too. And we were like, you don't need a sculpture. What actually this area really needs is a piece of kind of social infrastructure. The playground is, like I said, it's now a charity, and it's got regular funding from the Tesco Foundation, from Creative Scotland, from Power to Change, which is like one of the big kind of funding bodies in the UK that distributes kind of community funding. So it's a kind of whole hodgepodge. And the work in Liverpool is similar. Like some of the work is grants from government, some of it is funded through Turner Prize, some of it's funded through loans that have to be repaid. And it's, I guess why the reason why I kind of laboured some of the economic stuff is like, yeah, it's like understanding those relationships, understanding what the implications of different ways of getting money. If you borrow money, you've got interest to pay, is kind of critical in getting these things to work. And it's not saying that the architect or the practitioner has to know and be the one controlling all of that. But it's, I guess, we think it's very important that you're conversant in that, so you can be part of the conversation. You will still rely on kind of experts who will know more than you, but that you're part of the dialogue, because actually those decisions have a huge sway on actually what you can do. You know, if you're having to pay back 5% interest every year, you're therefore having to generate actually potentially a huge amount of revenue, and that will in itself determine the use of the project in a way that you may not want. Right? It means you have to be generating money every year from the project, and that might not always be possible. So these things are kind of quite critical.
Have you a project in Copic? For example, the children's playground, and it would be necessary to have such a thing in every town or village.
There are other ones. I mean, the different places in the UK had like history of quite really great playgrounds. Particularly, strangely, Wales has a really good culture of them. So does Bristol. And so we're kind of in the network of them. I don't know if any kind of brand new ones have been created, but it's definitely like hopefully something that I guess we don't. I guess maybe we don't think of us as being copied because we don't necessarily see ourselves as the creator. We see ourselves as like we were part of a kind of wider movement. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And yeah, and it's always a battle. I mean, but you know. Yeah. What? So structure. Sorry, let's just jump forward because you've seen these before. So this was, maybe I'll talk quickly about the Folly, just because I've mentioned it a few times. So this is the second project that we did, and so this had a very similar model to the Cinerolium. So it was volunteer built and led, and we had a kind of very strict rule from the beginning when we worked. Is like either a project was volunteer and then everyone was volunteer, or the project was paid and everyone has to be paid. And so we don't accept any unpaid internships in the practice. We pay London living wage for any practice. We only accept internships if they're tied to education. So there are a few places we've taught at that require a student to do a kind of placement that's unpaid. That's the only time we do it. So we're kind of very strict on that. But this project kind of, I guess similar to the Cinerolium, found this quite extraordinary but empty site. This is kind of one of the main A roads out of London. The Olympic Park is just to the right off screen here, so kind of very centred, and transformed that into this kind of fairy tale house that kind of played on the idea that the house may have been there before the roads were built, but instead of being built out of bricks, was built entirely out of timber. So the bricks were all recycled timber, and they're threaded together with rope to form a curtain on a scaffold structure. And similar to the other project, we kind of ran it, programmed it, inhabited it for, I think, 6 weeks. 8 weeks that one was. And the kind of revenue from it had to pay for the self back, so we kind of were in debt to ourselves until the kind of ticket sales came back in. We started, when you're asking how we worked, this is a while ago, with looking slightly less, looking slightly hairy, similarly hairy than it was then. So this is us designing for the kind of Folly. So at this time we very much were a kind of informal group. We were essentially a group of friends, kind of working together at evenings and weekends. Most of us had jobs, and because of that we could take this very hands-on approach. It's very labour-intensive approach. So this is us hoisting kind of the main beam up. You can kind of see how the bricks were, this kind of artifice of the bricks being kind of threaded together, and that's kind of the finished thing. And then the other maybe critical thing in the way we work is the space we work in. So I spoke in the beginning about how we're structured as 3 separate companies, and the kind of 2 main ones are the design firm and Sugar House Studios, the workspace firm. And Sugar House Studios really evolved out of a kind of piece of luck in some extent, which we basically were offered this industrial building next door to the Olympic Park that was due to be redeveloped, as is often the way. So this has now been demolished and moved on, and was sort was sort of a liability. And so we proposed to the landowner this kind of model of a kind of shared workspace that provided a kind of workspace for us. I'm sorry, the projector's really bleeding out drawings. So this was kind of our office in here, a kind of shared project and event space in the front, and then partnered with a group of carpenters who came from, there's a nearby college called the British Craft College that trains like cabinet makers, who were looking for a workshop, and they were partnering them to kind of set this workshop up. And then in the longer term, to create this new building as a kind of affordable workspace outside that. The room that we were in was actually a bunker that was built for a rave for a New Year's. So it was a kind of slightly strange structure of like no natural light except from the top. The kind of cafe event space over time didn't really work. It turned out that no one was coming. And so it kind of evolved into this kind of large scale assembly space that became a workshop both for us, so this is all kind of all our gear, but also enabled other people who were on site to produce kind of larger pieces of work. And then the workshop became this kind of open access workshop that anyone who was in the area, anyone who was within the studio complex could pay for access to what was a kind of very high quality like woodworking mill. So much better than we could afford. And that's kind of evolved this model that so far all of our workspaces do, that kind of aim to create like creative ecologies within the workshops. So it's worth saying that we're not like just studio providers. So there's a lot of kind of artist studio providers who provide kind of small scale studios, really great, very cheap. We're sort of almost a step above that, so a bit more expensive. They're larger spaces on the whole, and they're generally centered around like a piece of kind of serious infrastructure. So in Sugar House Studios, that's the workshop. There's a site in Brixton that's around fabric. But the design practice kind of evolved through access to this type of materials. So I think our methodology of hands-on working, of experimentation, is facilitated by the fact we had access to these amazing facilities. And so going forward, it's always been really important that we kind of hold on to that kind of equipment. That site has been demolished, so we've now got a new home in Bermondsey. So if anyone's in London, you're welcome to come say hi. We generally invite people for lunch if you want to come have a look. And basically propose to kind of adapt and move that model that was in the previous site into this new site in Bermondsey, expanding with a series of music studios which just happened to be in the building. It was an old school, and on the first floor they were just music studios. So we kind of adopted that as a kind of new part of the offer. It was part of it was an old pool. So part of the project was putting this new structure in that enabled kind of subdivision in habitation of the old pool. So this timber deck, and you can see the kind of shallow end sign there. The workshop kind of moved wholesale. So Steve, one of the kind of original workshop, and then front of house became a much more dedicated assembly space. So we've lost any ambition that it was ever going to be a cafe or anything public, but really is this kind of like assembly space, storage space, so that you can see the mock-up that was built for Goldsmiths. So that was like the way of testing it. Following that first mock-up I showed was a way of testing how it actually went onto the building. So you can see all the cladding rails there really. And then being produced was a kind of timber pavilion that was being produced there. Yeah. So I think critical in kind of our like workshop space and how the kind of workshops, how the spaces around us work. In terms of how we work, I've got a kind of a few slides that talk about that, if that's interesting, that kind of deal with some general questions that we often get asked. So, in the beginning, as I said, we were just kind of very informal group of friends, no real structure, no real hierarchy, but also no real business. Like I said, the first projects were really just done in the spare time. Following that, a whole group of us basically went back to study. So as I said, we founded it after we finished our bachelor's, but before our master's. And so in the interim couple of years, essentially, like a core group who didn't go back to study remained, but the majority of us, myself included, went back to do our master's. And over time, as people finished, we kind of gradually kind of grew and evolved. And over time, created this sort of slightly strange structure. Oh, shit, sorry. Go back one. Oh, it's not going to come back now, is it? That had a kind of revolving management group, so that you had a kind of term of 18 months. supported by a full-time finance manager and a full-time office manager, and then kind of everyone else was the kind of stuff left behind. What was good about that, it was very kind of egalitarian, very democratic. What was very bad about it is it didn't enable us to really develop any kind of speciality. You didn't, you just got the role you got when you arrived. So, I did business development one session, I did finance the other session. As a result, actually, people were doing stuff from scratch every time. And so more recently, we've reorganized that individuals instead have a more discrete interest in the management. So that within the kind of wider structure, you're now attached to a management group. And the idea being that you then can generate and really can learn and can get specialisms, and that also your role is kind of based on what you're interested in. So like someone like me who hates social media is not doing comms because I'd be shit at it. And there are people in their practice who are really good at that, that you play to your strengths. Decision making. The main so basically the way we make decisions is conversation, and it sounds really dry and kind of dumb, but the question that often comes up is like if you're 20 people, 12 people, 10 people, how do you kind of collaboratively make decisions? And the answer is generally long conversations. And again, the answer is we've developed this over quite a lot of time, developed like kind of loads of protocols and ways, but ultimately the thing is that we're still kind of governed by consensus. And the idea is that each of the groups I talked about are kind of delegated powers, but anything that's significant is brought up for collective discussion. And then we have 4 management meetings every year, where we kind of vote on all the kind of critical decisions. And so that votes on things like the budget, on things like employment, on things like pay, on kind of our agenda for the year ahead, which then enables like the different groups to kind of act within those. I think that photo is the wrong place. And then within that, controversial. As I said before, we've got this kind of slightly strange structure. So this is the official Assemble kind of world. It's actually, this is out of date because, as I said before, so Assemble Industries is the partnership. So that every employee who works with us for at least 2 years is invited to join the partnership, and that's about a 6-month process where they kind of shadow, they start coming to management meetings, and that then owns currently 3 separate limited companies. So when I present this last, Granbury Workshop was still directly owned by the LLP, and that's now been kind of spun off into employee ownership. And then in the beginning, in the kind of bad old days, we operated essentially like a kind of strange freelance model. So basically, if I billed £100, £50 would go to me and £50 would go to Assemble. And when we were kind of early on, that made a lot of sense in that it enabled people to kind of generate their own stability. It allowed people to kind of overwork on projects, to kind of take on passion projects, but it had a critical problem that it basically encouraged you to work in a very slightly selfish way. For example, if I was working on a project that was doing really badly, no one would want to get involved because they're not going to get any money because I've already spent all the money. And I think it made sense when we were doing smaller projects, more individual projects, and it was kind of this slightly more scrappy collective. But it didn't serve us very well in terms of an ambition to do more ambitious work. It becomes very hard to take on long-term ambitious projects like Liverpool because that requires lots of different people, lots of different expertise over time, and it's going to kind of go up and down in terms of what we get paid. So we've evolved now a much, I guess, more fair system that basically everything that we do within the Assemble world goes to Assemble. We have kind of standard kind of overheads, and then wages, pay throughout the practice is set by everyone involved in the practice once a year. So we've got a kind of essentially open book pay scale document that says what everyone at every level in the practice, from the kind of most junior member of staff to us, get paid, and that's kind of voted on once a year. So that's a kind of evolution. Yeah, kind of any kind of questions on that, or kind of, yeah.
Thanks very much to be so open. I think it's very helpful for the young generation to see that there are other possibilities than just to get engaged or to take a job at an existing office. I would also encourage you to start on your own, as long as you don't have so many fixed costs. You know, you can do a lot with from your house on. We have all learned it now the last 2 years that you can do a lot of homework, working bases. We have co-working spaces. To form a company doesn't need so much money.
No.
You can make a cooperative, 7 people together in Switzerland, and you are a cooperative, everybody pays 500 Swiss francs, and that's it. And there you are, and you can make insurance and whatever you need for working. I would recommend that you don't start alone, because you never get very far alone.
It's not very fun on your own.
Yeah, and today's construction, you need so many brains to get it's so complicated. You need more brains.
Yeah.
You have to be at least 2 or 3 or 5, or as I said, for a cooperative, you need to be 7.
I'd also say, like, I guess I showed you how much it changed, partly to say, like, we've not got it right. Like, we're not a model the model works for us. It works through kind of conversation, works through who we are, but, like, you know, do it better, in a way. You know, it's changed a lot. There's not really a right answer. And I completely agree. It's like, it often appears from the outside that a lot of these systems are very hard to get into, and actually they're not super difficult. You know, if you spend a bit of time, you'll find insurance. You know, most like older practitioners are often up for helping. You know, we have got employees who are working on their own projects, and we're happy to kind of mentor them and talk to them and, you know, help them out. I think, yeah, the opportunities are definitely there.
I have a question to you. Choose sometimes the project the comment you get, or is it for instance, if there now you have won prizes and you're well known, are there people coming and saying, I want you to make my house? Do you have a system or policy about that? And if there are also traditional projects that you've made, maybe less experimental, or? Yeah.
We say, people come to us a lot. We say no to a lot of the more kind of private housing stuff, mainly because we just think we'd not necessarily do the best job. We're not like the best set up for that. I guess within the groups, one of the groups focuses on work, and within that there's a person who really focuses on new work. And we have a meeting once a week. It's quite a short meeting, it's maybe half an hour, that he'll present any opportunities, any kind of conversations, and what they think we should do, and then that's kind of voted on. So it's a mixture. It's like there's overall like long-term aims that we've discussed and agreed, and they kind of a bit quite fuzzy. And then when we have opportunities, people will be like, well, I'm interested in that, I want to do that. And then I guess obviously we've got quite a big network now. You know, all the partners are kind of generating work, so we'll pull stuff in when people are interested. You know, if someone contacts me about something. But yeah, I think it's interesting because people come to us, but there's a bit of a lag where like people are coming to us, you know, or until maybe a year ago, were coming to us for temporary kind of pavilions, and we hadn't done one for maybe 5 years. But and now it's interesting that people are starting to come to us for some of the more like longer term. I don't know how you found it as well, that, you know, people are always coming to you for the work that you were doing before, but not necessarily the work you want to be doing now, because it's very slow. You know, like I was saying earlier, like there's none of these projects I'm working on anymore. Actually, except for Liverpool, like the project I'm working on, maybe I've been working on for 2 years, but there's nothing to show yet for them. It's a kind of slow burn. But I guess our ambition is to do more of that type of work, to do more work. Like, again, similar to how you work, that kind of longer term investments in a certain area with a particular client or group that a bit like Liverpool, a bit like Baltic Street or Sugar House, that can really allow you to kind of really experiment, not just with the materials, but also with the kind of social, economic structures behind the projects.
Do you want to grow?
Yes, but probably what we imagine probably is like more like potentially spawning more new organizations. I think, as we grow, also partners have slightly different interests, and they're people that, as they're developing specialities, actually want to work in a different way. So I was speaking before, there's a couple of partners who are looking at focusing much more on like community organizing, and doing that within Assemble Design Limited as a structure doesn't make sense. And so you can imagine the conversation is how they might become their own company that still exists within the kind of umbrella partnership to some extent, but it does its own work and is a kind of partner, enables them to focus on a different way of working. And I think that's sort of the trend. So it's maybe less growing as a whole, it's growing in numbers as a whole, but also that within that there are more specialities and more specific ways of growing that are seen as kind of complementary to each other, but actually over time become more specialist.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you here, and we hope that everybody comes to London and takes your invitation.
Yeah.
Love to see you. In another course, the day after our lecture, and people went there already. So that's great. Yeah, and I hope we keep in contact. And
yeah.
We built this regional European network. That was my aim also, to invite people from other countries so that we can really build up a strong network and copy or develop further your work, and you will maybe take up some ideas from us. And
yeah.
I think it's very important that we work together, we know what the others are doing, and so we can go a step further. Thank you.
Thank you.